Well, welcome everyone. This is Mara Carroll. I'm the Development Officer here at Jett Foundation. We're going to give everybody a couple more minutes before we get started. Maybe 2 or 3 more minutes, and then we'll get started with Dr. Natalie Truba. And yeah, just a couple more minutes. All right, well, it's a couple minutes after 4, so why don't we get started? Again, everybody, I'm Mara from Jett Foundation. Welcome to day 2 of our World Duchenne Awareness Day week-long virtual experience. We're so excited to have Dr. Natalie Truba, clinical psychologist at Nationwide Children's Hospital, joining us today. This year's global theme of World Duchenne Awareness Day is Duchenne in the Brain. And everyone we talked to said that Natalie was the person we needed to go to learn about Duchenne in the brain, and so excited for her to share her presentation with us. Natalie has opted to do a Zoom in case anybody had real-time questions that you can go ahead and share in the chat, and I'll share them with her. I can unmute myself. So without any further ado, Natalie, please take it away.
Thanks, Mara. Yeah, so if you guys have questions, just jump in, feel free, or shoot them a question. I'm happy to answer them. This talk is largely geared towards parents or people who interact with children with DMD a lot, and so hopefully it's still meaningful to those of you that are not parents or caregivers. So my goals today are just to provide a general sort of overview of how I'm understanding or conceptualizing the impact Duchenne has on physiological arousal, which is how I understand emotions and behavior, provide some basic strategies for managing said behavior, and answer any questions that you all may have. So first and foremost, kind of a quick and dirty into how I think. I am much more interested in topography of behavior, or function of behavior, over topography. And so most things that we're looking at are topography, right? So how something looks. Why is this kid running and jumping and grabbing stuff and blah, blah, blah? Oh, that they're impulsive. So we would label all of that constellation behavior impulsive. So the topography of that behavior looks impulsive. But the function might be something very different. The function is driving, that overt behavior. In this sense, is really where, for me, diagnostic classification gets really unhelpful. And I think particularly for boys with Duchenne and Becker, it's incredibly unhelpful because how we define something determines how we're treating it. And in these boys, I find that how we define these problems and then how we treat them often doesn't work. And so I'm not saying they don't qualify for these diagnoses. I just don't think understanding the mechanisms, underlying mechanisms, that contribute to like a standalone presentation of ADHD or OCD or anxiety necessarily may be the same mechanisms of actions that we're talking about for our boys, and why we see similar topography across these behaviors but the function driving them might be very different. So in my clinic, the most common sort of concerns reported by families and parents are learning difficulties, so generalized learning, direct learning, indirect learning, a lot of issues with attentional control and ability to like suppress or manage background stimulus, information processing, memory recall, oddities or difficulties, some really unique, really well-developed abilities with memory recall too in some unique ways. Sleep difficulties or difficulty winding down prior to bed, a lot of hyperactivity or restlessness, impulsivity or really quick to display aggression, low distress tolerance for noises or things that are aversive, like lights, sounds, certain sounds are more scary. Bathroom sounds tend to be a one that a lot of boys don't like. Difficulty transitioning from one test to another or tolerating changes in plans that they were not expecting. Rage-like meltdowns, it's how parents, I think, lovingly refer to them at this time, that kind of seem like out of the blue or that happened due to like something kind of small. Selective mutism is actually a little bit more common than you would think. A lot of hyperfocus with electronics, which is common in children with ADHD and autism and sort of neurocognitive function in general. And then a lot of perseveration or sort of like getting stuck in like one thought loop, or OCD-like behavior. So a lot of aligning, ordering, like liking things a very particular way, particularly like those things immediately in their environment. So a little bit different presentation than you would expect. So when I first started working with these boys, these are all very treatable things. Like we are pretty good at treating these things in psychology for the most part. So I did that, made it worse. Did that make any sense? So step back from the drawing board a little bit. And what I did was I'm trained in biofeedback. And so I started hooking all my boys up to biofeedback equipment and looking at their arousal patterns. And I started to see some really interesting stuff. So this is a drawing I use all the time with my families when I'm talking about what we're talking about today, which is how do we understand and make sense of our boys and what do we see? So you'll see over here on the x-axis, this is parasympathetic, sympathetic, sort of arousal responding. On the top, we would have like a fight or flight, freeze, collapse response, so an incredible, heightened sympathetic response. And on below, we would have like a somnolent sort of shutdown, full kind of out of it response. Over the course of a day, all of us sort of do this, right? Like you start moving, you're gonna have a sympathetic response, your body gets activated, right? You're moving, you're gonna go up, and then you sit down, you relax, your body starts to shut down, you go down. So, we function through this process of physiological balance all day, right? You go, you relax, you go, you relax. This excitatory, inhibitory, right? So it's this balance between these systems. I'm a pretty energetic person, but I'm not anxious. So I don't worry about a lot. I walk to work. So if I'm walking to work and somebody was hit through their car, you're going to see an arousal response like this, okay? So I'm going to have this swing and arousal, and we're looking at this, we're looking at skin conductance. So we're measuring how quickly your body is talking to itself, right? Like it's releasing sodium so that you can communicate neurotransmitter-wise faster to itself. And so we're looking at that, and we're saying, like, your body's like, whoa, I didn't like that at all. This red line indicates, like, where I would, probably normally feel that feeling. So if any of you have ever had that experience where you almost get by a car or something like that, you're like, oh, and you have that adrenaline surge, right? And you're like, whoa, and then it kind of like goes away pretty quick, okay? If any of you are really anxious or have an anxiety disorder, you'll notice that it doesn't go away as fast as like I'm talking about it going away, right? Because I don't have an anxiety disorder. But if you do, that can be delayed because your body now is already heightened and it's learned to be heightened, right? So it can take longer to shut down. So this is an arousal response that's based on me, a quick shutdown. But I'm going to feel it. I hit that line. I'm going to feel it. I'm not going to like that. It's probably going to take me a little bit longer because I fully felt that rush of like, oh my gosh, I just almost got hit by a car. So when I hook these boys up, what I see is a pattern more like this. And what this is signifying is a lack of shutdown over time, a lack of sustained parasympathetic shutdown, right? Over time. And this kind of happens over the day. I've not had a boy that I've hooked up that hasn't had a pattern like this to some degree. And I'm going to talk about why I think we see this pattern moving forward. But this is sort of what we're talking about, is this pattern of imbalance in arousal. So where they're so heightened aroused, so heightened, and it just carries, it adds throughout the day. So starting to see this pattern, I'm looking at these kids and these behavior, and all of this is really comes down to things that we would see, right? when you are incredibly overwhelmed, right? Like when your body is overwhelmed. So if any of you have ever been going through it and you got a lot going on, you're not sleeping well, something maybe in your personal life happens, you will notice, right? Like you are more particular about stuff. Like if you clean and you want stuff a certain way and you come home and somebody moved your stuff, like you're going to feel that. Not necessarily, you won't notice it in the environment. You're like, I don't know what somebody touched, but I know somebody touched my stuff, right? We've all had that experience. But when you live there and you're a child, it can start to look really weird. So what I mean by that is we're looking at the autonomic nervous system and we're looking at a dysfunction for some reason, wherever that is, in why the body isn't regulating itself. So the sympathetic system is our body's mobilizing system. This is our system that, you know, if there's a tiger behind me, like this is the system that would be like, you need to do something about that to keep yourself safe, right? It's a good system. It gets us to do things. Dominant during periods of stress, very driven by hormones, a lot of hormone involvement. That results in certain increases in certain biological drives like respiration and heart rate and blood pressure, and reductions in others like elimination and digestion. The parasympathetic system on the other side, right, is our energy conserving system. It's dominant during periods of stress or relaxation, and it's healthier to have this system, the parasympathetic system, a little bit more dominant over the sympathetic system, right? Because when our sympathetic system's going, it's just stressful to our body. It's a stress response, right? Not all stress responses are bad, but it's a stress response nonetheless. So our typical would be like, we're aiming for more parasympathetic than sympathetic. And for our boys, we're seeing the total opposite of that. So that's not how humans are designed to live, okay? In other words, another way to look at this, right, would be we have the brain. That's the first whammy that these boys have, okay? So whammy. Something's going on with their brain. We're not really sure what. We know it probably has something to do with dystrophin expression, how dystrophin expression impacts other things in the brain, right? And it kind of looks like their brains almost doesn't have this ability to sort of suppress or ignore or not attend or not be excited by stimulus all the time. And so it's almost like their brains get hijacked. And so then they're just bombarded by the sensory stimulus all the time. And so they don't habituate. So their brain is always attending to things it really should be like kind of minimizing and starting to ignore. So if I could ask everyone to just step outside of this conversation for a minute and pay attention to your room. Do any of you like notice a fan or a noise that you didn't notice until I just asked you to do that? No. If any of you do though, or if you've ever been in a room, you'll notice that and you're like, oh, I can't believe I was suppressing that. You'll go back to suppressing it. The longer I talk and the more you start paying attention, if you quit trying to listen to the noise, it'll go away. Your brain will suppress it. It'll be like, we don't have to pay attention to that anymore. When your brain doesn't do that, right, it can get really hard to focus because that is something that keeps us cognitive sort of stamina. It helps us preserve that. So it's exhausting for that not to be working. Over time, this then is like leads to this very hyper arousal of the sympathetic system. They're always kind of on, and they develop this really chronic physiological pattern of arousal, right? Because our bodies learn to respond to certain things, which is why when you're approaching a certain time, if you eat lunch at the same time every day, you'll notice you start to get hungry around that time. But if your lunch changes, right, you'll be like starving for a few days, and then your body gets it together and it starts to get hungry around that new time, right? If you've ever hated a job, and you're like, I love life, I woke up, I'm in the best mood. And then you start driving to work and you notice that you start to feel bad, right? Your body is attending to environmental cues. Like we learn associatedly, subconsciously all the time. And so this can be a really problematic thing for these boys, right? Who can quickly start to generalize these learned patterns of chronic physiological arousal to areas they really shouldn't be. But then we have also then how Duchenne affects the muscles, okay? And this is the second whammy. And so their breathing muscles are super impacted. And when I have them in my equipment, they all have this very anxious style, this chest style breathing pattern, which makes sense because their diaphragm is affected and their chest muscles are affected that help them with inspiration, expiration. So they can't activate that as much, which is why I think when I was training deep breathing and doing these very evidence-based things, I just made it all worse because they can't do that. And it makes them very oxygen hungry, actually. So we train almost like a chest style pattern of breathing, which we wouldn't normally do, right? Because when we think about evolutionarily, why are we the way we are? Our breathing is what tells our brain what's going on. And so breathing is wild. It's like we take it for, I mean, we don't take it for granted, but we take for granted our ability to control breathing in certain ways. And so, you know, like a quick short breath like that, like that's a startle, right? Like that tells our brain like, oh, something's going on, I need to be ready, right? We're very deep, slow breathing. It tells our brain like, oh, things are fine, right? Like we can trick our brain into believing all sorts of things. Powerful tool. So this anxious style of breathing then I think gets in the way of that shutdown for that parasympathetic system, or that sustainment, right? Because they do try to shut down, it's just to sustain it. And so I think because they have this anxious style of breathing, right, it kicks their body back up. So even though their processes are trying to work, their muscles kind of get in their way of that, and it kicks them back up. So that's the second whammy. And then these combine, right, over time to really start to impact operant level and neuronal level learning patterns. And so these are the patterns that are activated very quickly with low sort of stimulus contact, because they have such learned history, right? The action potential is just huge. And so what happens then is these boys, because they have this like heightened pattern, they have that window that I'm talking about, that window gets really, really small. And what happens when your window is small, this is common with in trauma literature, if any of you are well versed in the trauma literature, in trauma brain, like you see the same sort of phenomenon happen, where when our windows get small, we have much lower distress tolerance thresholds. So little things that wouldn't normally bother us now bother us. And that also then leads, right, when our window is small and we're super heightened, to an increased threat response sensitivity. And that is when we start to misperceive neutral and positive stimulus as potential or genuine threats. And this will be if you've ever not been your best self and maybe your partner did something and you reacted really poorly to that. And then they were like, whoa, like this is what happened. And you're like, oh, I just totally misperceived that because I'm like totally in my head about this thing at work, right? That happens. And so you can misperceive things simply because of the state you are in biophysiologically. And so what happens is now even little things like somebody saying hi to them or something can like start and give them a startle response. Not that they're scared cognitively, right? This is just how our bodies react. And then they start to do really maladaptive things to cope with that, right? Like they start to line and order and like things very particular because they're just trying to keep whatever around them as calm and stable as possible. Like they're actually telling us like, I need to feel better. Like, I don't know why I feel crazy, but I feel crazy. And that's kind of how that feels when you have all this chaotic energy and there's no way to shut down, right? Like you just want to scream and like take your skin off. I don't know if any of you have ever felt like that, but that's how it feels. And so they're just doing what they can to try to keep it together, which is exhausting. So these things are happening for each of our boys and they're all individuals. This is kind of what gives us our behavioral phenotype. And we can classify these boys to a degree based on, phenotype or sort of what we would think from an arousal standpoint might be helpful. They don't all present the same, but they do present similarly. And then, we add steroids, which makes things a little bit more challenging. So we're working here in this high space. So anything kind of at or around that red line, we're feeling that feels bad. So even before that, that's not great, right? Like we don't want to get before that. It's like this space is too high, like that's bad, like that's heightened. This is super high. This is where you're probably going to start to see like a lot more behavioral meltdowns, a lot more like you're like, whoa, what just happened? That was out of the blue. And then this is when parents are saying cluster meltdowns. Like we are melting down for hours. We're having meltdown after meltdown after meltdown. My kid won't sleep for days. This is where they're so hyper aroused that we actually start to get really, really nervous that we're going to damage ourselves because like our behavioral health is so mismanaged. Like we're not sleeping. It's hard to eat. They are super restless. They can't sit. They're almost a danger because like we don't want them to fall and injure a leg or something either. And we see this sometimes. And so, all of these points are bad. All of these points are to be avoided, right? If you miss an earlier point, it just gets worse. And we see behavior co-occur in that way with this arousal pattern. And this is why, right? This is why we're up here, right? Why we also start to see disordered coping, right? So for OCD, for example, targeting this is more of an overflow, like a physiological, seems to be, we're having more success with that because if we look at it or like, this is a sign that you're over aroused and you're feel crazy inside and we target that, we see that behavior naturally go away, right? Which we wouldn't see in OCD. So if we look at this more of a self-soothing or a warning sign, right? We wouldn't really want to treat it. We don't want to get rid of it. It's helpful, right? It tells them, I don't feel okay. I need to do something about this. Because if I do something about this, I'm not going to order anymore. Okay. Likewise, perseveration or getting stuck in those thought loops. So if any of you have a boy with Duchenne, you will probably know this experience where they get stuck on a thought. It could be like, when are we going to grandma? We're going to grandma's next Tuesday, right? We're going to grandma's next Tuesday. We're going to grandma's next Tuesday. Are we going to grandma's next Tuesday still? And that'll go on for days, weeks, maybe. Depends when you tell them. And they just keep asking. They're stuck in this thought loop. Same places like kind of selective mutism. I kind of conceptualize that similarly. When you're so aroused, like you freeze, right? Like, so perseveration in that thought loop is kind of being frozen. Freezing and not talking at all is also freezing. And we see that similarly in our MDX mice, right? So in certain learning, well, in all the learning trials, when the mice are startled, right? Or there's a startle paradigm in there, the mice will freeze and they just kind of don't move. And that's when they're startled, hyper-aroused. And that feels similar to me, to these boys when they get stuck in these spaces, because lo and behold, when we calm them down and we're able to shut them down, that naturally kind of resolves itself, right? So again, I think if we look straight at topography of their behavior, we are being guided down a path that's making us believe these are these standalone mental health conditions, when really, like, these are behaviors that are probably telling us a lot of things that we need to be paying attention to about processes going on in these kids' brains. So what do we do about that then is a good question. So we got to move from the top to here, because when we're here, not ideal, we're getting close to that line, but when we're here, right, our window is big. If we shut down, if we can get a good shutdown, we're shutting down, we're like maximizing our shutdown, right? Because we're going to shut down and we're going to be able to build up a little bit higher. Shutdown, when we're too high to the peak, doesn't do us as much good, right? We're getting more bang for our buck if we can get a good shutdown earlier in our chain, okay? So the name of the game for right now, until we find something better, is really working to stay ahead of this for these boys and at learning the pattern of escalation and arousal, as well as triggers, and how to best manage to stay ahead of that so that they can then start to learn to self-manage this on their own, which they can do. It just takes some thoughtfulness. So we want to stay ahead of it. That's the name of the game. We kind of think about this as trigger management or antecedent management. So we're managing antecedents. We're managing the things that come before the behavior meltdown. We're managing the things that lead to XYZ. This is more of a proactive versus reactive, right? Like most parenting tends to be reactive because people are busy and you gotta do. So you're like hoping for the best. My kids are behaving themselves, so they're not. And then you're like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? Don't do that thing. Give me your stuff. And now we're reacting, right? We're reacting because you did something I didn't like, and I have to react to that. Totally normal way to parent. Not trying to parent shame anybody. For these boys, though, we do want to take a different type of approach, because when we're proactive, we're going to reduce the opportunity to kick that arousal up more because we unintentionally come in too hot, or the boys misperceive something because they're so heightened. We really want to increase that distress tolerance. We want to have that window be as big as possible. That way, if we mess up, we're not now out of our window, because once we're out of the window and we're above that line, you're just riding that. It's like a panic attack. It might last hours. You're just doing that behavior meltdown at that time. So we want to avoid that, right? So if when you get to a point and you're like, oh, this kid looks like they need a break. If they look like they need a break, you already missed the window. Okay? So we're staying ahead. When I say ahead, I mean ahead. We also want to increase the time that we have to intervene if there is a full meltdown, right? Because again, we don't want to get to the point that we're out of that window, because now we're chasing, right? And now it is what it is. So we want to stay ahead of it so we have a lot more control over the situation, because then we can optimize their ability to learn. And so we all have to be a certain amount of aroused to learn, right? Again, arousal is a good thing. We need to be aroused. So we got to have sympathetic arousal to learn, but we can't be so aroused, because then we don't learn. So it's a sweet spot, right? And these boys are always kind of out of that sweet spot. So big problem for learning, but a really big problem when we need you to get good at recognizing what's going on and how to prevent it on your own, right? And so that window has to be big so that they can practice things with success, because they're really bad at it once they lose it, like we all are. It's even harder for them. Structured schedules, concrete behavioral expectations, producing predictability and routine whenever possible is incredibly important. One of the best ways to do this is by creating habits and rituals for managing and responding to known triggers, such as transitions, change routine, bedtime, so that there's a routine. They tend to be pretty rule followy and rule governed, which is wonderful. But you can use that in a way that isn't necessarily rules, right? Like, but more like routines, like this is how we get ready for bed, this is what we do. And what that does is it's unintentionally training them at a very like associated learning standpoint. Like I was telling you, you're driving to work and your brain's like attending all these things and being like, oh, I'm getting mad because I have to go to work. You can use that to your advantage, right? To like facilitate shutdown for sleep, right? It's intentional pairing of these things to basically be tricking the brain, hijacking it the other way. We're hijacking it to be like, oh, I'm getting tired, instead of being like, oh, I'm super excited and fearful, right? So, you know, goes both ways. It just takes a lot of effort. I'm not saying these things sound easy. They take a lot of effort. I will be the first one to admit that. You want to modify and manage sensory and environmental stimulus, including people, as often as possible and as often as needed. One of the best ways to do and to stay ahead of this, and it's actually one of the biggest interventions I do, and I never see people again because we start this and a lot of people are like, yeah, that worked wonders, we're good, is schedule breaks throughout the day, regardless of activity. And we do this on the weekends, we do this in school year, we do this over Christmas vacation, we do this on our birthday, we do this during Christmas, we do this every day, because it's just like if I have type 1 diabetes and I don't take my insulin, doesn't matter if it's Christmas or not, I'm gonna be in trouble. So if we don't manage this, it's going to happen. It just is. It's important. It just is part of who we are. And the boys understand that. And once we can get on a good scheduled break sort of routine, most of the boys love it and actually ask for their breaks and like want their breaks. And they're just like, I do better and I like it because you feel better, right? Like these boys don't like to get in trouble. They get in trouble. They just don't like to get in trouble, many of them. So, you know, usually start with like low stim environment, nothing competitive, right? I actually avoid competition for these boys at all costs if you can, because it's just going to set them off. But the low stimulus is important. So Legos, coloring, songs, things like that are great. Electronics, tablet, YouTube, not those during low stim. Most people find breaks starting around every 60, 90 minutes for their younger kiddos is a good place to start. And then we build from there. And so some kids need breaks once a day. Some kids need breaks every couple hours. Some kids need breaks every hour. Some kids, we do a break on all day Wednesday and we truncate their day so that they can go to school. Because everybody's different. But at the end of the day, like finding an idiographic schedule that works for your kid is incredibly important, because it needs to be maintained consistently at home, at school, at daycare, at grandma and grandpa's, wherever, right? Because again, being on schedules is really, really helpful to these boys and really, really helpful to them from a regulatory standpoint. Schedules are good for any of us for regulation, but they're incredibly, incredibly helpful for these boys. And we want to manage YouTube. I don't know what happens to these kids' brains with YouTube. It does not happen with video games. It does not happen with watching video games. People play video games on YouTube. Where they get in trouble is when when the boys are those boys that like novel videos that are kind of weird and those rabbit hole. And it just does something to their brain. And they really have a hard time disengaging from those sort of periods of time when they're allowed hours of uninterrupted weird YouTube video watching. So one of the things that I start with a lot of families is regulating that to like 30 minutes at a time, and that seems to be working really well. Most of the boys can disengage after 30 minutes. They might not like it, but they can do it, right? And then they can go back later. I'm not saying only 30 minutes a day. I'm saying 30 minutes at any one time. Because otherwise I think it's too much for their brain. You want to avoid punishment-based interventions whenever possible. It's not always possible, obviously, but whenever possible, do. Because they're really sensitive to potential threats because they're so heightened. So even non-threats, genuine threats, they're likely to kick things up, right? We don't want to exacerbate them when they're already dysregulated. Instead, we want to start using more of a token economy and implementing token economies at home and across school. I'm a big fan of token economies. So in a nutshell, token economy focuses on children earning tokens for appropriate or desired behavior that they can turn in later for access to a desired reward, right? So I'm not taking your tablet because I'm mad at you and you did something wrong. You did not earn access to your tablet because you did X, Y, and Z. It's not me. I'm not mad. you didn't do this thing, right? Like, I don't come to work, I don't get a paycheck. It's not because my boss hates me, it's because I didn't come to work. This is what it is. These rewards need to be agreed upon by parent and child prior to implementation. I don't know a kid that I started token economy with that doesn't love it. Most kids love it because it's an opportunity for them to also earn, right? It's a monetary system. They want a new video game? Cool. How many tokens is that? What do they have to do that, right? So it reduces a lot of fights. It can change significantly the structure of dynamics in the home. It's easy for schools to implement token economies usually because they have people that do that. And so you can generalize and have a continuity from home to school, which can be really helpful from like linking that for these boys that like your behavior at school matters. And like that could be something you earn tokens for towards something you're working at home. But that way, if you get in trouble at school, you're not also in trouble at home. You just didn't earn those tokens. We're not taking anything from you, right? It's also much more hopeful because they can just always earn back and they can get their video games for later as long as they get it together for the afternoon. We want to train relaxation. It's really important for them to learn how to relax and calm their bodies. Again, we want to do more of a controlled chest breathing than a deeper diaphragmatic breathing. I haven't found luck with progressive muscle relaxation, obviously, right? So a lot more wiggle-based stuff and like grounding type movement activities that they can do in their chairs that has also been helpful, but the breathing piece is really important, and positioning. So a lot of my boys, as they get older, they start to, scoliosis is developing, they start to have these weird posturing, and what you'll notice is like their oxygenation will get not super low, but low 90s, right? And if this is happening throughout the day, you can imagine how quickly something could startle you and you could get aggressive. And that's kind of what we see. And we do simple interventions with our teachers where it's just like we train an awareness sign, and that just lets the kid know like, oh, I have to sit back, right? And they sit back and it opens their lungs up and they can breathe better, right? And then lo and behold, over the day, they are getting less angry, right? So again, like, is it that these boys have standalone psychopathologies? I don't think so. Can we make sense for why we see them act the way they do based on what's probably going on in their brains and bodies? Probably. So let's treat that, and this will kind of get better, right? But if we treat that, we're missing the boat here, and we might actually be like making them much more distressed, because what would work for these boys that don't have Duchenne may not work for this, because the process why it's happening is very different. You also maybe have to train attention, which is hard for these boys because obviously if your brain's hijacked, it's really hard to focus on one thing. Sometimes you have to start really low, especially for the younger kids where we train like 15 seconds at a time, sometimes less. And we just have a little timer and we'll put a toy on their belly and we're just practicing counting our breaths, right? Not that I think those are good breaths. That's not the point. The point is I'm asking you to do something and you're doing it, right? Like you're focusing on this thing that you don't want to, that's boring. And anytime they talk, we just restart that timer. Oh, 15 seconds, bud, we gotta do 15 seconds. And you do that, and you 20 seconds, 25, 30, and you're just training that process, because you cannot train anything else. You can't say, hey, I need you to stop and focus on me and calm if they do not have attentional control. It's not gonna happen. You can't say like, hey, what do you need to do right now? Go if they don't have attentional control. So without attentional control, a lot of these other things are not helpful, okay? So sometimes you have to start there, and that's fine because these boys do have a lot of attentional issues. Make it fun. It could be a fun game. A lot of parents have fun. We can think of fun ways to do that. A lot of classical conditioning, I've talked about that kind of briefly, but even certain, if there's some boys are really like olfactory driven and they do really well sense, and we can pair that with calming, and the boys love it. They respond really well. Parents can like, put some essential oils and some cotton balls in their pocket in a plastic bag, and they'll be like, hey, like we're gonna take our break in the car today and we're just gonna like chill and smell our oranges, and everyone's like, yeah, that's awesome, right? Because the point of that is that this has been paired, that this makes me calm. So something used to take me 15 minutes, because I've trained it, I can smell my oranges and feel calm in 2 minutes. That's awesome, right? You'll not hear me give a talk that I say like, we're gonna get rid of this. And I wish that I was, but I'm not. I think what we're hoping for is reducing frequency, intensity, duration, latency between events. But I think this is part of having Duchenne because of how it affects the brain and the body. And so we want to also set fair expectations and be kind to ourselves that sometimes you just mess up and like you're going to have bad days, right? It happens. Like we can use those as moments to also coach our boys and like, yeah, it happened. Like what did we do wrong? Did we sleep last night? Let's go back. Let's check this out, right? Like These are opportunities to learn. So right now, this pandemic changes things. Huge change in what is normal and a huge change in routine. So both difficult things for these boys. Also a lot of unknowns and a lot of misinformation. And so I've had a lot of boys on some real crazy panic spirals in nonsense land around just wild conspiracy theories that is really hard to shift them away from. And so I do think it's important to monitor and be aware of the information your boys are consuming right now, because this is a population that if they get a thought or a belief or focused on something, it can be hard to shift them from that. And so not controlling that in some way can be really problematic, and it will impact you in that way because it can be hard for them to shake it, as you know. They also are really sensitive to the environment, right? Because they're heightened, and so they're sensitive to everyone around them. So if you're not your best self, these kids are not their best self, and society right now is very distressed. And so I think that's the other big thing that we're seeing in a lot of these boys is a lot more anxiety and just about the state of the world and what's going on around them. There's also no trusted roadmap for what to do, which I think is hard for them. It's hard for all of us, and I think it's really, really hard for these boys. Managing this for any of us takes abstracting, right? Ability to separate wholes from parts and like recognize shared experiences and all of these things, but then also like an acceptance and a willingness to sit with discomfort. Like I'm okay being not okay. Neither of these are strengths for these boys. They can be, they're just not at baseline. And so like, that's already kind of like digging out of a hole for trying to like cope with everything going on and how different their lives have been. The other thing that is helpful is developing new routines and schedules just for your new normal, right? So that way you're not, when you have to transition out of COVID, lockdown procedures, you go back to our old routine, right? So, well, this is our temporary routine, and that can make it easier for the boys to shift into that other mindset versus like, well, we don't do that anymore. No, that was a temporary, right? So you want to compartmentalize that to a degree because we want to be able to transition them back into school, because I don't know about y'all, but the majority of my kids are like loving life, not going to school right now. So we're going to have an issue with that, trying to get these boys back to school. So the more proactive we can be managing that a little bit, I think would be helpful. I do think there's also an opportunity to build in some structured, unstructured time to help them start to process and make sense of internal experiences like thoughts and feelings and emotions. Like this is hard for all of us, but it can be really hard for them because they do go from 0 to 100. I mean, they're never actually at 0, but they don't know that. And so they miss a lot of cues, like warning cues, warning signs. They ignore a lot of internal signs of distress, right? And because they're heightened, they misperceive and misprocess information in the environment that they're consuming. Specific time might be like exercises and identifying and labeling emotions, like watching a movie and being like, pause and be like, hey, what do you think that they're feeling right now? Why do you think that? What are you paying attention to? What do you see on their face, right? Like, why not this? Why not this, right? And you're just helping them learn to think, right, about humans and emotions and like, why this and not that. And then maybe some more unstructured time, like, hey, go write in your journal or, you know, read a book about the superhero or something like that, that maybe gives you a different framework for understanding yourself or the world. And then you could talk about it like the next day during your structure time, right? You also want to model adaptive coping, especially when stressed or distressed. The best predictor of child coping is always parent coping. So fake it till you make it, or just make it, because that's important. So if you're feeling it, your boys are feeling it. So if you are not your best self and you're going through it, it's going to be harder for them. So one of the kind of things you can do for your kids is take care of yourself. Sometimes it's okay to just schedule worry time. If you have a kid who's just a worrier and you're like, holy cow, you're driving me crazy. Like I might lock you outside of the house today if you keep asking me and telling me about these worries. Schedule time. Like we're going to worry for 10 minutes and then I'm literally going to ignore you the rest of the day. Okay, somebody? So let's go. Get all your worries out. Tell me all the worries, right? And you just listen and be like super into it and be like, yeah, don't validate them. We're just like, yeah, those are worries. Wow. Right? And then your timer's off and you're like, okay, and we're done. I'm not listening. And they could keep talking to you, but don't respond to them, right? And I'd actually encourage you to like have them write them down and put them in a worry jar, right? That you can look at later if you want to, but we don't need to because they're just worries. And sometimes we don't have to validate or pay attention to worries. They're just there, right? And now we're teaching them another pathway and strategy for like sitting with that thing where they normally just want to perseverate and ask you over and over and over and over and over and over. You also want to focus on their ability to endure life, right? Like they have hard lives. Like they already do more than the average person. People don't make them feel that way. But I was just having this conversation with one of my young adult patients who's in college and applying for graduate school and feeling like he doesn't do enough because he's not in research and all this stuff. And we had to go through his day about how everything takes so much more time. So really when you factor out your day, you're actually doing so much more than most people, right? If you can do that, you can do anything, right? If you can get up every day and take 3 hours to like get out of bed and get ready, but something that takes people 25 minutes, you can do anything. So we can't predict the future, but we can plan for what will happen when something happens we didn't plan for, right? And so we know that you can do all these hard things. We know that you can handle feeling distressed because you do it every day, right? When we lift you and you have to get situated and like you hate it, but you do that. This is the same thing. So a ritual around how we're going to cope with that can be really helpful, particularly in these moments when things are really new and novel, and they don't have a sort of repertoire from which to pull from, because at least then they have something that they can do in that state where they're maybe not thinking for themselves that great. Helping them develop a list of positive self-talk statements is also really helpful here, because they can get caught in these really negative feedback loops, thought loops. And so a list that focuses, I find, can be more helpful to focus on some of their strengths and like how they endure, right? Like I'm really good at asking for help. I'm really good at problem solving. I'm really good at computers. I'm really good, right? Like what are the things they're good at? Pull that in, right? And you're training them. I'm going to say this to myself. I'm going to say this to myself. I'm going to say this to myself. Okay. Or I can say this to myself. I can say this to myself. Because if we're spiraling here, we've got to counteract that here. And you're not going to be there forever. And they're going to need to know how to do this. Okay. Because things are going to happen in life and they're going to need to know, like, even if I'm struggling right now, I know I have these strengths that I can rely on to like problem solve this. Okay. Even if it's just asking somebody for help, that's okay. So positive self-talk statements, I think, are helpful and important, but take time to develop before they come automatic. You want to fight the urge to give in to constant checking and reassurance seeking behavior. So my rule is we tell them 1 time a day, right? If they ask about something, I actually will get to a point that we don't even do that sometimes because they do know the answer. And we're a broken record. So unfortunately, that going back to that green spike I showed you, that process of arousal, what's happening is those boys are having like a green spike, right? So they want to know something, so we're seeing like a blip in excitement. I want to know, someone knows. And then what happens when you tell them, like, yes, we're still going to grandma's on Tuesday, is they feel better, okay? And what's that training them to do is to not tolerate this distress around wanting to know if you're still going to grandma's on Tuesday. And then what happens is the next time they feel it, they're going to ask sooner and even faster, because now I'm being trained to not tolerate sitting with this distress because it's not genuine distress, right? It's not distressing whether or not we're going to grandma's next Tuesday at 7 o'clock. You're distressed because you are focusing on it. I'm not going to partake in your dysfunction. If you want to overfocus on that, you can go write it down and you can think about it. We're not doing that because you already know when we're going to grandma's because you just told me, right? And that's okay. Sometimes we just have to do that because they will constantly check, because that's what happens when your brain is overstimulated, right? I don't feel okay, like we're going still, it's still right. And you're like, yeah, you're like, okay, I feel a little bit better. Builds back up. So it's not actually helpful. If anything, it's making it worse for yourself over time. So if that's something your kids do and it drives you crazy, quit doing that. For all of these things, we want to practice during periods of non-stress. So when they're cool, calm, hanging out, we want to practice. Okay, so like before bed, if bed's not crazy, that's a good time. Or in the morning, if morning's not crazy, that's a good time. As they get good and they can actually do these things relatively decently when you ask them to with good fidelity, then you want to up the ante and we want to start to have them do it during periods of excitement, because the process of arousal for excitement and the process of arousal for anger is the same in many ways. And so I've had we have a lot of success with this. So, and the boys get into it because what I'll have them do is play video games. So what we'll do is we have them play video games, but like this is a structured practice with a parent, and what they're doing throughout of it is they're just coaching and prompting calming practice as these boys play video games. Because you'll see it, they'll be like, oh, and you're like, okay, you gotta calm yourself down, right? And we have them calm, right? Because they're doing this fun thing. And now we're just practicing in the moment what they need to do. And we can pause it if we need to, right? So parents can do that, and we're not gonna lose our game, but that teaches us, like, that's a natural punishment, that's a natural timeout procedure. Stop. You want to play. I'm withholding this from you until you put effort into regulating yourself. Okay. So that's really motivating. They're going to put the effort in. It's a good way for them to learn because they want to play video games. So that's a good proxy. I use that one a lot, and I encourage other people to use that too. You want to foster a growth mindset, right? We're either winning or we're learning. So it's constantly like, what did we learn from this? Like, we won here, and where are we learning, right? You're only failing if you don't learn. So teach that, foster that, and so that they can go back and be like, man, this is where I messed up and probably could have like managed myself better. Yeah, man, it's a great thing to learn. More people need to learn that. And then you want to be kind to yourself and others. You want to teach them things like gratitude exercises, because I think it's easy for people to tell you when you have Duchenne that you don't have things to be grateful for, but they do, and a lot of them are very grateful for things, and that can be a big buffer. And also can be helpful to facilitate doing nice for someone else to help ourselves feel better and feel good. Because they can always do things for other people that make other people feel good, even when they can't necessarily use their hands to do them, right? And so this is, I think, an empowering thing that gives them a kind of like a roadmap for how to cheer yourself up when you kind of rely on other people to do all of those things, right? That's something that they are totally in control of and can do on their own, and they don't need anyone else to be kind to others for them. So that is my talk, and I'm happy to take questions that anyone might have, or not. That's fine as well.
Thank you, Natalie. That was super informative and really interesting. If anybody on the call has any questions, you can drop them into the chat. Or honestly, you could probably just unmute yourself and ask a question if you like. It looks like we've got a question, and obviously from a nutrition standpoint, what types of foods are best for sympathetic, parasympathetic system balance? What are the worst kinds of foods for those systems? Good question.
I can't answer that. I am not a nutritionist, so that's a really good question. But I would definitely work with a nutritionist, because there are foods that are going to be worse from a sort of glucose sugar standpoint than others, and sort of breakdown of carbohydrates. And so that's a really good question, and a lot of parents do report like a lot of parents carry certain high protein foods with them, and if their kids are struggling, like, they notice if they give them a certain amount of protein, their kids do better. So I definitely think there's something to nutrition. I don't think I have the expertise to speak to that question, though. It's a good question.
Yeah, good question. Anyone else have any questions for Natalie? See anybody? Well, thank you. That was really wonderful. I know we do have some parents, and we have some of our industry partners are on the call, and it's just, great information for us all to have, and grateful that everybody that's on the Zoom today could spend World Duchenne Awareness Week with us today. And Natalie, this was wonderful. We will be having this recorded on our website so that others can watch it in the future. And yeah, if there's no other questions, we'll let you go, and just thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.